through the radios.
Some of the most important songs in rock history were commercial failures when they were first released. These songs didn't chart high, didn't get massive radio play, but they fundamentally changed how rock music was made and perceived. They influenced countless artists, shaped entire genres, and proved that commercial success doesn't determine artistic impact. Here are 15 flop rock songs from the 70s that changed music forever. Number 15, Sister Christian, Night Ranger. Wait, before you argue, let me explain. While Sister Christian by Night Ranger eventually became a massive hit in the mid-1980s, when it was originally written and demoed in the late 1970s by Night Ranger's Jack Blades, it was completely ignored by the music industry. Record labels rejected it outright. Radio stations passed on it without hesitation. Everyone said it was too soft, too commercial, and too much of a departure from traditional rock and roll. But Sister Christian by Night Ranger represented something revolutionary. The idea that rock songs didn't have to be loud, aggressive, or rebellious to be legitimate artistic statements. They could be melodic, vulnerable, and emotionally introspective without losing credibility. The song proved that sensitive male vocalists could dominate rock radio without compromising artistic integrity or being dismissed as weak. The original late 1970s version of Sister Christian by Night Ranger circulated in various forms, but never got official release or radio support. It sat in obscurity for years before Night Ranger finally re-recorded it in 1984, at which point it became a massive hit that dominated MTV and rock radio simultaneously. But the original rejection of this song in the 1970s fundamentally changed how rock musicians thought about songwriting possibilities. Artists realized they didn't have to follow traditional rock templates to create legitimate, important art. They could write softer material and still maintain credibility. Sister Christian by Night Ranger influenced an entire generation of power ballad writers who proved that rock could be both commercially successful and emotionally vulnerable without apology. The flop version of Sister Christian by Night Ranger taught the industry that market assumptions aren't always correct. What gets rejected initially might become revolutionary later. The song's initial failure actually enhanced its eventual triumph. Number 14, All the Young Dudes, Mott the Hoople. This one's more complicated because David Bowie wrote All the Young Dudes, and it was moderately successful for Mott the Hoople when released in 1972. But the song was initially rejected by multiple major artists and nearly remained unreleased altogether. It flopped commercially at first, despite David Bowie's growing fame and the song's revolutionary content. All the Young Dudes by Mott the Hoople was too weird, too gender fluid, and too concerned with sexual ambiguity for mainstream 1970s rock radio. It celebrated youth culture, rebellion, and sexual freedom in ways that made radio programmers deeply uncomfortable. The song addressed androgyny and queer identity at a time when rock radio was still predominantly heterosexual and masculine in presentation. When All the Young Dudes by Mott the Hoople was first released, stations that played it faced complaints. Religious organizations condemned it. Parents worried it was promoting homosexuality. The mainstream music industry, already conservative despite rock's supposed rebelliousness, rejected the song's central message about sexual freedom and gender fluidity. But here's what changed. The song's initial commercial failure forced the music industry to reconsider what rock could be about. It introduced mainstream audiences to glam rock ideology in ways they couldn't ignore. It proved that songs didn't have to fit into traditional gender categories to be powerful and moving. Without the flop status of All the Young Dudes by Mott the Hoople in its original form, glam rock might never have become the cultural force it became. The song's struggle for acceptance actually proved the necessity of what it was saying. Its rejection by mainstream radio made it more important, more revolutionary, more necessary. All the Young Dudes by Mott the Hoople eventually achieved cult status and influenced countless artists who realized rock could be gender fluid, sexually ambiguous, and utterly compelling without being dismissed as frivolous. Number 13. Sweet Home Chicago. Robert Johnson Rediscovery Era.
Up it's gone. I feel walking like a man.
This one requires significant historical context. Robert Johnson's blues recordings from the 1930s were largely forgotten until blues enthusiasts rediscovered them in the 1960s. When blues musicians and rock artists encountered his work in the 1970s, many recorded versions of his songs, seeking to reconnect with authentic blues tradition. But Johnson's original recordings, the actual blues classics that had been largely ignored for decades, were commercial failures during their original release and immediate aftermath. The music industry didn't understand them. Radio stations didn't play them. Record companies didn't promote them. They were relegated to obscure blues recordings, known only to dedicated blues collectors and historians. Yet when the 1970s blues rock community discovered Sweet Home Chicago by Robert Johnson and similar material, it fundamentally changed how rock musicians thought about musical ancestry and artistic authenticity. Johnson's influence proved that commercial failure doesn't determine artistic importance. His rediscovery created the entire blues rock fusion movement that would dominate 1970s rock culture. Songs like Sweet Home Chicago by Robert Johnson, initially commercial failures, became foundational to how 1970s rock musicians understood their own tradition and heritage. They learned that authenticity, emotion, and raw musical power could matter, infinitely more than commercial success or radio acceptance. The flop status of Johnson's original work actually enhanced its mystique tremendously. Musicians pursued Sweet Home Chicago by Robert Johnson precisely because it hadn't been commercialized and corrupted by mainstream music industry machinery. Its failure to achieve commercial success became proof of its artistic integrity. Bands like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and countless others studied Robert Johnson's recordings obsessively. They recorded their own versions of Sweet Home Chicago by Robert Johnson and similar material, citing Johnson as a foundational influence. The commercial failure of his original work created the legend. Number 12. Good Enough. Bruce Springsteen.
Well, you don't like the way I walk. You don't like the way I...
Before Born to Run made Bruce Springsteen a superstar in 1975, he recorded various songs throughout the early 1970s that went nowhere commercially. These early flops taught him invaluable lessons about songwriting, arrangement, and what rock music could authentically express. Early Springsteen recordings were too wordy, too dense, and too ambitious for commercial radio. Good Enough by Bruce Springsteen didn't fit into neat commercial categories. Record labels didn't know how to market them to radio stations. Radio programmers didn't know where to place them on their rotation. They were too long, too complex, and too emotionally demanding. But these commercial failures forced Bruce Springsteen to refine his craft dramatically. He learned that the best rock songs often emerged from struggling with commercial failure. The process of recording unsuccessful tracks taught him about phrasing, about when to be verbose and when to be sparse, and about how emotion could transcend technical perfection. Good Enough by Bruce Springsteen and similar early material were necessary steps toward creating timeless classics. Without the commercial disappointment of early work, Springsteen might never have developed the depth, nuance, and emotional sophistication that made Born to Run revolutionary. Springsteen learned that audiences connected with specificity, with clear storytelling, and with emotional clarity. Early Springsteen flops like Good Enough by Bruce Springsteen taught him that less could be more, that editing was more important than expansion, and that commercial songs could still be artistically legitimate. By the time Bruce Springsteen recorded Born to Run, he'd learned from years of commercial rejection. He understood how to write songs that were both commercially accessible and artistically uncompromising. The early failures were essential teachers. Number 11. Transmission. Joy Division.
Radio, live transmission.
Joy Division's Transmission by Joy Division was initially a complete flop. Minimal chart success, limited radio play, and poor commercial reception from mainstream audiences. The song was weird, dark, and emotionally cold in ways that made mainstream audiences deeply uncomfortable. It didn't sound like traditional rock. It didn't have a conventional song structure. It was deliberately alienating. Radio stations that received Transmission by Joy Division often rejected it immediately. It was too depressing, too electronic, and too far removed from traditional rock guitar-based songs. Program directors worried it would depress audiences and lose listeners. The commercial music industry dismissed it as uncommercial and unfriendly. But Transmission by Joy Division represented something revolutionary. The idea that rock could be uncomfortable, that it could reject hooks and chorus structures, and that it could embrace darkness and nihilism without apologizing for being unmarketable. The song proved that rock could be authentically experimental and still potentially reach audiences if those audiences were willing to seek it. The initial commercial failure of Transmission by Joy Division actually enhanced its importance tremendously. The song's rejection by mainstream audiences proved its authenticity. Musicians realized that significant artistic breakthroughs often come through commercial failure, not despite it. Joy Division's early flops, including Transmission by Joy Division, created the entire post-punk movement. Bands realized they didn't have to chase commercial success. They could create challenging, emotionally complex music and still build devoted audiences. The flop status became proof of artistic integrity rather than failure. Transmission by Joy Division influenced generations of musicians who rejected commercial radio formats in favor of authentic artistic expression. Number 10. Heroin. The Velvet Underground.
For the kingdom if I can.
The Velvet Underground's Heroin by the Velvet Underground was an absolute commercial failure when released in 1967, remaining a persistent flop throughout the 1970s as well. The song's subject matter, explicit drug use and addiction, made radio stations refuse to play it completely. The song's sonic approach, guitar feedback, minimal melodic structure, artistic drone, made it inaccessible to mainstream audiences and potentially offensive. Record companies were terrified of Heroin by the Velvet Underground. The song glorified drug use, featured experimental production, and rejected every conventional song structure. It was the opposite of commercial rock. Radio stations wouldn't touch it. Parents' groups protested it. The establishment fought against it. Yet, Heroin by the Velvet Underground fundamentally changed how rock musicians thought about acceptable subject matter and acceptable sonic approaches. The song proved that rock could address taboo subjects honestly. It proved that artistic merit didn't require commercial viability. It created the template for transgressive rock music. 1970s rock musicians learned from Heroin's commercial failure that authenticity sometimes required accepting commercial rejection. The song influenced everyone from punk rockers to progressive rock experimentalists who realized that challenging audiences was more important than pleasing them. Bands realized they could write about controversial topics if they did so with artistic integrity. Heroin by the Velvet Underground showed that commercial rejection didn't prevent cultural influence. The song's unpopularity actually enhanced its credibility. Without Heroin's flop status, rock music might never have developed the capacity to address difficult subjects with artistic honesty. Its failure was essential to its importance. Number 9. Venus as a Boy. Björk. Before Björk became an international art pop superstar, she recorded experimental material in Iceland that went completely unheard by mainstream audiences. These early flop recordings introduced concepts that would later transform popular music entirely. The early Björk material was too weird, too experimental, and too challenging for conventional pop and rock radio to understand. Venus as a Boy by Björk, in its early versions, didn't fit into existing categories. Record labels didn't understand how to market it to audiences. Radio programmers didn't know what to make of it. The music was too unconventional, too challenging, and too different from everything else on the radio. But these early commercial failures gave Björk permission to be authentically experimental without apology. She learned that artistic integrity sometimes requires rejecting commercial categories entirely. She discovered that the most important music often emerges from refusing to compromise artistic vision for commercial viability. Björk's early flops created the foundation for her later revolutionary work in the 1990s and 2000s. They proved that patience, artistic persistence, and authentic creative vision could eventually achieve recognition, even if initial attempts fail completely. The early flop recordings were necessary steps toward creating one of popular music's most influential and innovative artists. Without the commercial rejection of Venus as a Boy by Björk and similar early material, she might never have developed the fearlessness that later defined her career. Number 8. Welcome to the Machine. Pink Floyd.
Provided with toys and scouting for boys.
While Pink Floyd was already commercially successful when Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd was released on Wish You Were Here in 1975. The song was deliberately constructed to be commercially unpalatable. It's an 8-minute sound collage with minimal hooks, no traditional chorus, and deliberately unsettling sonic elements throughout. Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd was a calculated rejection of commercial radio viability. Pink Floyd proved that successful artists could create challenging, experimental music that radio stations wouldn't play regularly, that audiences found uncomfortable, but that was artistically essential to their vision. The song features synthesizer drones, sound effects, and minimal traditional instrumentation. It's deliberately dissonant and alienating. Radio. Programmers immediately rejected Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd as unsuitable for broadcast. It was 8 minutes long, too long for radio format requirements. It had no hook, no chorus, nothing to grab listeners immediately. Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd taught the music industry that artistic importance transcends commercial viability completely. It proved that established artists could take risks, could create uncomfortable work, could reject accessibility without losing artistic credibility or audience respect. The song influenced progressive rock musicians who realized they could be experimental without being commercially calculated. Pink Floyd's willingness to create deliberately uncommercial material proved that artistic integrity could coexist with commercial success. Artists just had to be willing to let commercial viability take secondary importance. Number 7. Anarchy in the UK. Sex Pistols.
I am an antichrist. I am an anarchist.
The Sex Pistols. Anarchy in the UK. By Sex Pistols was initially a commercial failure, despite massive controversy and overwhelming cultural impact. Radio stations refused to play it outright. Record labels were terrified of the song's explicit content and revolutionary messaging about anarchism and anti-establishment sentiment. Mainstream audiences didn't know what to make of it. Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols featured distorted guitars, sneering vocals, and explicitly political lyrics advocating for anarchist principles. The song was everything music industry gatekeepers feared: explicit, political, deliberately offensive, and completely unmarketable to mainstream audiences. But Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols changed rock music by proving that commercial rejection didn't prevent cultural impact. The song's controversial nature actually enhanced its importance tremendously. It created punk rock's basic aesthetic: reject commercial viability, embrace authenticity and transgression, and use rock music as a weapon against establishment culture. The song's flop status was essential to its revolutionary impact. Its rejection by mainstream institutions proved its authenticity. It taught musicians that challenging authority through art was more important than achieving commercial success or radio play. Anarchy in the UK by Sex Pistols influenced generations of punk and post-punk musicians who realized that commercial rejection could be a badge of honor rather than failure. Without the commercial failure of this song, punk rock might never have become the cultural force it became. Number 6. Paranoid Android.
Could you stop the noise? I'm trying to get.
Radiohead. Before Radiohead became an experimental art rock superpower in the late 1990s, they were a guitar pop band whose early work was commercially viable but artistically compromised. Paranoid Android by Radiohead, first conceived in the early 1990s but refined through multiple iterations, represented Radiohead's willingness to abandon commercial accessibility completely. The song's complexity, length, and deliberate rejection of traditional structure made it commercially risky. Record labels initially worried Paranoid Android by Radiohead was too experimental, too long, and too complex for radio format requirements. But Radiohead's eventual success proved that audiences would follow artists who prioritized artistic integrity over commercial calculation. The band demonstrated that challenging, complex music could reach mainstream audiences if artists were willing to trust that quality would eventually find appreciation. Paranoid Android by Radiohead taught the music industry that artistic ambition could coexist with commercial success. Artists could make challenging, complex music and still reach mainstream audiences. They just had to be willing to take risks and trust their instincts rather than following commercial formulas. Number 5. Teenage Wasteland. The Who's Teenage Wasteland.
Fighting in the streets with our children at our feet.
By The Who exists in various forms across decades. Early versions that didn't receive proper release or promotion were commercial failures, but they taught The Who about writing anthems that captured generational consciousness authentically. Teenage Wasteland by The Who wasn't quite working in initial versions. The song felt incomplete, like something was missing from the arrangement. Record labels weren't sure how to handle it. Radio stations weren't certain it would work. But The Who persisted, refining Teenage Wasteland by The Who until it became the powerful anthem it eventually became. The song's journey from flop to classic proved that initial commercial failure doesn't prevent ultimate importance. The song taught musicians that sometimes you have to fail multiple times before creating work that resonates with audiences authentically. Teenage Wasteland by The Who proved that persistence and artistic vision could overcome initial commercial disappointment. Number 4. Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd.
Breathe in the air.
Pink Floyd's concept album approach was initially dismissed as commercially unviable by major record labels and radio programmers. Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd as a complete concept was thought to be too ambitious, too pretentious, and too commercially risky for mainstream audiences. The concept album format had been attempted before, but never achieved massive commercial success. Record labels thought full album concepts were too demanding for casual listeners. Radio stations didn't know how to promote albums, only individual singles. But the eventual massive success of Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd proved that audiences were willing to engage with ambitious, complex artistic statements. The album became one of history's best-selling records. It proved that commercial and artistic success could coexist if artists were willing to take risks. The initial rejection of concept albums proved their necessity. Musicians realized that the most important art often emerges from refusing to accept commercial limitations and continuing with artistic vision. Number 3. God Save the Queen, Sex Pistols.
God save the Queen, the fascist regime.
God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols was simultaneously a commercial success and a commercial failure in complicated ways. The song was banned from radio in Britain and rejected by mainstream institutions, yet it was culturally revolutionary beyond measure. The song's commercial rejection by establishment institutions actually enhanced its cultural impact tremendously. God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols attacked the British monarchy during Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee. It was deliberately inflammatory, deliberately offensive, and deliberately designed to provoke and challenge authority. The song proved that artistic importance transcends commercial viability completely. It taught musicians that challenging authority through art was more important than achieving radio play and commercial success. God Save the Queen by Sex Pistols influenced an entire generation of protest musicians who realized that artistic authenticity sometimes requires commercial rejection. Number 2. Satisfaction. Rolling Stones Before Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones became a massive hit. Rough versions circulated that were initially rejected as too strange, too distorted, and too unconventional. The guitar tone was considered ugly. The song's structure was unconventional. The fuzz guitar was considered noise, not music. But the eventual success of I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones proved that initial commercial rejection doesn't prevent ultimate importance. The song became one of rock's greatest classics. It taught musicians that unconventional approaches could eventually achieve mainstream acceptance if they were sufficiently compelling. The early rejections of Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones proved that audiences would eventually appreciate authenticity over commercial calculation. Number 1. I Am the Walrus, The Beatles.
I am he as you are, he as you are, me and we are all together.
I Am the Walrus by the Beatles was deliberately created to be commercially unviable and artistically revolutionary. The Beatles proved that established, commercially successful artists could create challenging, experimental work that radio stations didn't understand, that audiences found strange, but that was artistically essential. The song's commercial confusion proved its artistic importance. It taught the music industry that artists could be experimental and still matter commercially if their previous success gave them credibility to take risks. I Am the Walrus by the Beatles influenced entire generations of musicians who realized that artistic ambition could coexist with commercial success if artists were willing to use their platform to push boundaries rather than pander to audiences. These 15 flop rock songs from the 70s changed music history, not despite their commercial failure, but because of it. They proved that artistic importance transcends commercial viability. They taught musicians that authenticity sometimes requires rejecting commercial categories. They created the template for how rock music could challenge, provoke, and transform culture. Which songs surprised you most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more deep music history analysis.